Welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Executive Editor for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Data-Centric Strategy and Roadmap. This year's February edition in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Now, the floor to Megan Jacobs, the webinar organizer from Data Blueprint, to introduce our speakers at today's webinar. Megan.
Thanks, Shannon. Hello and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at Data Blueprint. We hope that you found the time to join us for today's webinar on building a data-centric strategy and roadmap. As a big thank you goes out to Shannon and Dataversity for hosting us. In just a few moments after I let you know about some housekeeping items and introduce your presenters. We will have 1 hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. To answer as many questions as time allows, but feel free to submit questions as they come up throughout the session. To most commonly asked questions, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and any other information you request during the session within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. We use the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you're logged on, feel free to use it in your tweets and send questions and comments that way. We'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed and include any answers to these questions in our post-session email. Now, I'll introduce you to our presenter and also our special guest for today. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. Dozens of articles and 8 books. Most recent is Monetizing Data Management. Presenter for today is Louis Broom, innovative and practice thought leader in data management, who has been creatively disrupting the approach to data management. He has 20 years of experience successfully designing, managing, implementing, and leading global data management and information technology solutions. His whole track record is marked by strong leadership coupled with a passion for driving data and technology solutions from a clear business value proposition. Louis has been published in multiple industry periodicals and is currently the CEO of Data Blueprint. The presentation is actually a preview of a workshop that Peter and Louis will be doing at EDW.
Thanks, Meg. This is Peter and my business partner Louis, who we were just looking back over history and discovered that the first time I had actually presented together was back in 1996. So it's been a long, successful run with us.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and get us kicked off and go over the outline. So the outline of the presentation, right? So data strategy overview. This is the why, what, and how the data strategy with the emphasis on the why. Next section, determining the business needs, is really getting on the same page with your business partners, getting a foundation, common understanding of the business model, and then at specific business opportunities. So, and success criteria in business terms, right? So this is a critically challenging and somewhat elusive activity. Ultimately, this is the outcome, though, that really matters most to the business. So once you understand the business needs and measurements of success, then we're going to talk about developing the strategy solution that fits in that box. And then finally, we'll give you an introduction on developing a roadmap and a plan. This topic, along with others, will be covered in more depth at EW. Just kicked off about overview of a data strategy. Some of you may have seen this video before, this TED Talk, and it was powerful, and I would highly recommend. But it's basically a presentation on the power of understanding why we do things. What we do, it's why you do it. So we cannot overemphasize how important this is. To a degree, the better we understand the why, the easier it is to drive a solution. So we come back to this a lot. We see this as a problem really quite often at kinds of levels. So it's more common than you can imagine. So that is how we saw a $30 million data warehouse get built and end up with a single user. There's more to come on that. So So why do we need a data strategy?
The key for this is that you have to understand data strategy in context of strategy in general. And if we go to Michael Porter, the chart I'm showing you here on the screen, the y-axis, the one that's pointing upwards, is an innovation dimension. The x-axis, the one that's pointing to the right on your screen, is improving operations. We generally talk about effectiveness and efficiency. And like all consultants, we have a four-quadrant diagram on this, where quadrant one is where the vast majority of the companies are. They're just trying to keep the door open with little or no focus around data as an asset. If you move into quadrant two, you're looking at and then increasing efficiency and effectiveness. And move to quadrant three, you're using data to create strategic opportunities. However, the skills and abilities of the team that can successfully implement something in quadrant two are completely different from the knowledge, skills, and abilities that somebody is trying to do in quadrant three. Now, most organizations, when we talk to them about data strategy, and since we do that kind of work, we get a lot of questions around this, they go, and they really do want to do something around analytics, which is their word for saying innovation around data. The challenge is, of course, going directly from quadrant one to quadrant three without going through quadrant two. Do it. You can move directly from Q1 to Q3, but it takes longer, costs more, and delivers less at greater risk to the organization than if you learn to crawl, walk, and then run by going Q1, Q2, and by the way, Q2 will just save you enough tangible money that you can use to fund Q3 without having to ask for additional funds along the way. Very few of the organizations that we've worked with have mastered both Q2 and Q3, putting them in a quadrant four, very specialized category. And if your organization is thinking of doing this at all, consider yourself very fortunate because only 1 in 10 organizations actually has a thought around data strategies.
So my data strategy. So in our view, right, I believe, as most of you would probably agree, the marketplace for most every industry is driving fast and furious to be information-based. So while everyone may acknowledge this, very few actually live it or operate as if it was true. Our view is that the future companies will compete on being competent, agile, and innovative with data and information. We have found there's still a wide gap between that future place and where people are today. Right? Generally, people have thought of data having direct impact on business value by determining which products to sell to which customers and which context. But it's evolved, I think, to mean much more than that when we talk about information economy. And here are ways that we look at it. And first, when data and information is becoming part of what we buy, whether it's products or services. People really are willing to pay a premium for information. So it becomes part of the thing that we're actually buying, and that is one way that companies can compete. Is that obviously information is power, in the marketplace. So having a 360 view and situational awareness of you're operating, whether it's suppliers or customers or regulation or whatever it may be, this is important. So, and the last one I think is really kind of interesting is that, organizations are really being put at greater operating reputational risk, just the sheer amount of processing that they have to do of data. So again, this is sort of talking about in our current legacy processes and not even where we're trying to get to in the future. I mean, this is really causing companies, I think, a lot of problems and putting them at risk, and we've clearly seen some of that recently. So this, in our mind, highlights why a data strategy is important.
And Lewis won't say it, but he's got a great blog post out there. It's at the bottom of the screen, so check that out. He's got a little bit more on this particular topic.
Thanks, Peter. So putting the strategy together. So this, again, sort of highlights the breakdown of the presentation. So we're going over understanding the business needs, both foundationally and specifically, right? It's about really understanding your competitive advantage for your company, because that is where the data strategy needs to align, right? So you can't really understand the goals, strategy of your organization, of your business, if you don't understand how they're going to be measured. And then, again, we're going to get into this holistic solution and approach. The note at the bottom is maybe the most important point on the slide. really is that we find organizational change is the biggest challenge because companies have to think differently about their data, and it just cannot be overstated. All right.
That's our biggest challenge we've encountered as we've worked through these.
Yeah. So getting into determining the business needs. So your company's competitive advantage, right? It's important to have this fundamental understanding of your organization's positioning in the marketplace. This is the foundation your company has built its success on. There are several ways to look at this, and there are a lot of business gurus out there that have come up with all kind of frameworks how to do that. But you can bet that this is the fundamental concept that management consultants are analyzing a business, they're thinking about this. So we're talking about thinking like a management consultant. So it's different. We often talk about we want to be the management consultants of the data management world. But you notice there's confusion around this quite often about understanding really what the competitive advantage is. Maybe confusion within your own organization. An example I'm aware of is, the credit card company that I know that they think they're a data company. At one point, a large discount retailer tried to compete by introducing some more high-end products, and it was just a complete flop, and it's clear to the customers. So the idea of competitive advantage that you really, maybe everybody understands it, but I think it's important to point out, it's not being the best. The best is sometimes referred to as a race to the bottom. Being the best means everybody is doing the exact same thing, and the winner will be the one who does it the cheapest. And the idea really is to be different. So sometimes being inexpensive is and it creates a competitive advantage, but not if that is what everybody else is doing. It's about adding value in a way no one else is, whether that is being good at providing low-cost solutions and creating operational efficiencies, or because you have specialized skills that no one else can mimic. So again, the framework at the bottom are some examples you can use. So going to get into this a little bit. So this is one of those frameworks that we look at for competitive advantage. And three components to this. There's lower cost versus the differentiated. And loss is just focusing on things like operational efficiency, low-cost suppliers. The differentiated is just having a focus on innovation, introducing new ideas and product features. Right? Going the other way, it's narrow versus broad. So you get the four quadrants. You could be narrow, broad, you could be low cost, or you can be based on being different. And not all, it's very rare for someone to be in the center, but occasionally some people can sort of be a bit of both. So a quick example of this is the Walmart, clearly a leader in low cost, and their market is very broad. Where Whole Foods is being very different, so they're offering very different products you can't find anywhere else. They put together a unique combination of goods, but they're still being fairly broad. Trader Joe's is in that center spot where they're low cost, but yet they're providing high quality goods. So Target could also potentially be. But so the key here is to get this concept and understand where your company is positioned, because again, it's probably somewhere in one of these quadrants, one of the four quadrants. So,
or more to the point, it's unlikely to be broaching two of them.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So now, if you understand how your company is positioned, the next piece is really to understand how does it specifically create that competitive advantage in that particular positioning that it's taken on, right? So everyone has a unique value proposition that gives them an advantage. That's why they've been successful. Additional focus on what is important to the business. So again, the reason for doing this is everybody, and you hear people say a lot, the data strategy needs to align to the business strategy. But I think for us, the piece that's been missing is, well, how do I understand the business strategy in such a way that I can align my data strategy? So this is one way to do it here at Data Blueprint. So I'll just go through this quickly. It's really talking about who has leverage in your particular situation. Sometimes the buyers have leverage over your organization, and sometimes you have leverage over your buyers. Suppliers, OPEC was a great example of someone who clearly was a supplier that had huge influence, drove the world markets, but specialized skills such as transplant doctors, the type of supplier. So, and it also could be expensive to change suppliers. So, who has leverage over who in the relationship between your company and the customers, the suppliers. Another component that drives competitive advantage is new entrants. So how easy is it for a new entrant into the marketplace in which you're operating? Is it capital intensive to get there? Because your airline industry, well, it's expensive to go out and get airlines. So are there many other options for customers if they become price sensitive to what you have to offer? And the bottom one is, or the center one is more subjective. It's really about, how competitive is the marketplace, like Coke versus Pepsi. And the point is to have some sort of framework to get your organization's competitive advantage, because more than likely their business strategy will be focused on either shoring up their strong position or trying to push back with a disadvantage. All right. Quick example, just looking at Hyundai and Porsche. Hyundai their customers are cost sensitive, it's onto a broad range of buyers. Porsche, clearly very much a niche market, very differentiated. So look at those two, their positions, looking at the five forces in the table, you can see how they sort of fall out. But the key point here is that the Porsche, customer data is really important to them, because retention and repeat customers is really how they maintain their profits. And so they will have very specialized or individualized relationships with their customers. So how do they manage that data? So they're really into R&D to be, different and a differentiated product, right? Research and development, constantly developing new product features. It's kind of the opposite, right? They're very price-sensitive customers, so they're really into operational efficiency. So if you're thinking about your data strategy, these are the areas you want to dive into at these companies to go look for, because, and it's not to say that they don't care about, the Porsche doesn't care about operational efficiencies, but if they're going to look at operational efficiency versus R&D, they're going to go with R&D every time. All right, so the takeaway, find out what is important to your business partners and focus there. And it makes for a smaller elephant to try and eat when you're looking at the data that we have to work with. This is an excerpt from an article for the IO Update, and I just thought it was interesting how their value propositions for leveraging data matched up nicely to the five forces. Insight and innovation, right? That's really about being differentiated. Establish barriers to competition, right? That's making it hard for new people to enter. Operational efficiency, again, that's around low-cost providers. So, it's a repeating theme that when you're looking at business value, these are the areas you want to look. So just to quickly summarize, they're useful for a couple reasons, because it sets a vision for why we practice data management. I think that's really important, and I think that's something that I know in my career I've struggled to do. And I think many people skip this step. But it's because people look at data sometimes as having IT-driven goals and not business goals. So we need the business to be more, have more ownership and accountability for how we leverage data in the organization.
Great summary of what essentially is an entire semester's course, how to do strategy. Some may have encountered something similar in business school, but let's talk about the real world now as we encounter it. And when we go in to do data strategy work for organizations, we generally find that we end up with one of two conclusions that comes away. One, the organization has a great business strategy. And what that really means is that they've got a great business strategy as an organization. Then they also have a really wonderful IT strategy, and underneath that they have a data strategy, and all three are aligned perfectly and working really, really well. And we see that, maybe 1 in 10 customers? The other part of it is the other 9/10 of them we find out that the strategy they have actually is either could be improved or is really not well expressed at that level. So then you have to apply some analysis to the process and to figure out what is their strategy. We use a lot of what's called reverse engineering analysis so that we can tell them what is the most important parts of their processing world that they're doing and how doing a lot of it seems to indicate what their strategic needs are in certain areas. And if it's not, it's a good fail for them to come back and react to. So the key, if you have a business strategy that you can start to work towards, is to find out what changes would be seen as useful or important and plan to do something that is useful, or probably even more so than useful and noticeable in the organization.
Okay. Tool and success criteria during business value. To fully understand the organization's business goals and objectives, they have to be measurable, or there's not a full definition. So, working from a data management perspective, I've often struggled with this myself, getting at how to measure the business value. Like, how do you measure, quantify the business value of data quality or enterprise data architecture? So, I've worked through that. We found that it takes a clear business need that can be measured to derive the value of the underlying data strategy activities, and that in absence of a clear value proposition, the business value of a data strategy is unknown. So we would be looking at one side of the equation when we'd be looking at the cost side if we not measure the value on the business side. So to measure the value of a business opportunity is critical in the development of a successful data strategy. Again, we look at another framework here, understanding really what we mean by measurement. Again, there's some depth that needs to be understood to really get that concept. But this object of measurement, I think, is really an important part to the concept of understanding why. It's too often assumed that we understand what we mean when we're going to say we're going to measure customer satisfaction, or we're going to measure customer retention. These end up being ambiguous once you start to get into it. So Porsche is very interested in measuring repeat customers, and Hyundai is very interested in measuring or counting the number of cars sold. But if someone was looking at customer satisfaction, we may get into the conversation, well, what's a customer? And so a customer, may be someone who actually hasn't bought from us before in that particular context. And if you don't define that, it becomes difficult, or you will not really be able to get the measure that the business wants. So that's important. And then methods of measurement really is, this is your tool bag. Just the sampling would be an example, Bayesian theory, and others.
One of my favorite inspirations around this area is a book by a fellow named Douglas Hubbard, who I just love giving a shout out on this. It's a fantastic book. It's $25 at Amazon. And, I hate to push everybody else's books instead of ours, but this is really worth reading if you're faced with something as Lewis was just describing. If these things seem vague to you, it's probably only because we aren't practiced at it. Yeah. And one of the things that he talks about specifically is when you start doing this analysis, you start to formalize stuff. And Lewis, we've had many of these discussions as we're introducing our junior associates to this process. One of the things Lewis emphasizes over and over again is rate and get down. I hope that didn't blow your speed out, everybody, but it's emphatic there. Because the minute you have a picture in your mind, you can have something that's worth criticizing, whereas the ideas are vague and they just don't help on that a whole lot. A wonderful exercise in this, chapter 7 of this book that I'm showing on the screen here now, talks specifically about measuring the value of additional information to a decision. And one of the things that he goes in and proves pretty emphatically is that most people put too many variables into their equations. If you simplify, you actually get better results in order to do that. We're going to talk to you about how we did that on one particular customer's approach at this point.
So I'll tee up the example, and this is a data blueprint example. A client of ours, an international chemical company, they do a lot of research and development in creating specialized chemicals to go into oil and gasoline as additives. So fairly large company, $1 billion plus. Basically would have the customer will come to them and they sell oil on the market for people to put into their cars, and they'll come to this company and say, well, we want to sell oil for high-performance cars that will keep the engines running cooler. And these guys will go away and customize a formulation to meet their product specifications. So over the years, these researchers have run tens of thousands of tests at 25,000, 250,000 each to create these formulations for customer requests. And it's a very exciting environment because, you know, you walk through the halls and there are all these labs, and their labs are a big engine block sitting on a stand with 1,000 probes on it, taking all kind of measures to make sure that the formulation is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So, so in this case, the objects of measurement, the things that we're really focused on, going through this exercise that we've been talking about, test execution, customer satisfaction, and researcher productivity. So again, what they were figuring out was we have all these tests that we've run previously. We should be able to leverage that data in such a way that we can reduce the number of tests that we actually have to run, because we understand if we add a little bit more phosphorus, given the other variables in this formulation, that will run cooler at higher RPMs, and to the point of where they can almost formulate the solutions for their customers. And because they were finding that they were actually end up running essentially the same test over and over at the very expensive cost per test. So we talked to them about the test execution, the customer satisfaction. Then, if they could virtually formulate the solution, they were getting a quicker time to market from initial request to certification. And then, of course, you have these PhD researchers who don't have to repeat something that they've done before, or that could do much quicker. So again, the number of tests to get verified formulations per researcher were the objects of measures.
So talk about how this all worked out. One of the things that our team did was go into a process map of what was going on in the organization. And I want you to imagine the map you see on the screen now without all the circles and lines drawn around it. And just coming up with that process map, they considered that we had done a superb job because they'd never been able to figure out what the actual process was. So here we are in an exact instance of what Lewis was saying before, write it down, and now we have something that's improvable and we can start to make sense out of it. Now, the other interesting part that happened on here, though, from a data strategy perspective, is that while we had the process map done, we then added the dimension of time. And so what you see on the right-hand side, there are 6 major categories of non-value added work that these PhDs were doing. And these PhDs did a wonderful job of actually implementing this, but as data scientists, they were only about 20% productive. Their time taken up by literally transferring digital data between different machines, moving it around manually, manipulating it, doing what we call synonym reconciliation. There were tribal knowledge requirements, and at the heart of this whole thing, the piece of red icons that you see there, it was all being run on Fox Pro, which, you know, hasn't been a product for many years. So here was a way we could add a person to their group who helped them with data management practices, and the entire group got to be more productive as a result, allowing them to go back to their strategic strategy that they had, which was, again, was run over before through pieces.
So I just want to make one other comment about that, Peter, and make the point that we've been talking about. So again, here's an organization that's very focused on innovation, R&D. While the process here was very inefficient for the researchers, while useful and they found value in that, it was the fact that they could do more research, not that they were necessarily more efficient. Again, it seems like a subtle difference, but if you were to come in and tell them, you know what, I can make this really efficient for you so you don't have to do all these things, that's where their head is focused. Their head is focused around R&D and results and being innovative. So again, I think it's very subtle, but it's important in that that's how you understand that that business operates, and therefore how to bring the value proposition to them.
Cool. Of course, by putting in a data strategy that included elements of process improvement, architectural components that needed to be developed, aspects of data quality that they needed to be educated about and giving them a more integrated system development process. It reduced the number of tests that were needed to get them to product. It increased the number of tests available for researcher, and it reduced the time to market for new product development. And time to market turned out to be a big driver. In this case, I kind of looked at Lewis and said, they told us we saved them $25 million. We didn't charge them enough.
Yeah, we left some money on the table there for sure. So just to summarize this section on measuring business value, this concept really is a skill unto itself. So it makes sense to bring someone onto your team who has background in statistics, operations research, financial, someone with similar experience. But either it's a step that can't be skipped. As Peter said earlier, you need to become familiar with these concepts, and you need to practice these skills. Again, I think the important point is that you can't really develop the data strategy and the solution and drive business value if you're not sure how the business is measuring that value. It's important that if people can understand these concepts and develop these skills, it will endear you to your business partners, right? All of a sudden, you're speaking a common language and you're understanding how to measure that value to really help them measure their own success and build trust that the strategy is really important to the overall business model, which ultimately, to get buy-in, you're going to need. Okay, so moving into on developing a solution to address needs. I'm just really going to outline the structure of this section now that we understand that the business needs and the measures of success. So rethinking the SDLC, this is really saying that you've got to think about this differently. And I really love how Peter has sort of formulated this idea. But then we look at the holistic part, right? This is the data strategy. And I think this is the piece that most people are probably familiar with to some degree is, okay, well, I'm going to get a holistic solution to be able to better leverage data. And so we go through that. I'm going to go through it kind of at a high level of what all the components are in the description and a few examples. But at EDW, we're going to go into these in much more depth and how they're all integrated together. And then the last one is just a quick point about matching your organization's abilities to deliver. This feeds into the roadmap concept. So to be successful, you can't overpromise.
So the first piece around this is that we've been teaching everybody in IT how to build things incorrectly. And that's a pretty brazen statement for me to make, but after studying this for 30 years, I'm really convinced. I hope you'll agree with me after these two slides. It makes sense that we should, in response to an organizational strategy, develop some specific goals and objectives so that we can see whether we are on track with that strategy or not, and whether that strategy is in fact achieving the results that we want. And it does make sense to the next level of thinking to say, let's talk about systems and applications that will help support the achievement of those goals and objectives. Network and infrastructure becomes a next step on that, and data and information usually become an afterthought at that point. For example, if at step 3, we decide that the answer is an ERP, then every discussion, the network and the data part becomes about the data for that ERP and the network for that ERP. That absolutely guarantees that the data is going to be formed to the applications instead of around organization-wide requirements, which is why we spend so much time reformatting our version of customer for the 16 different definitions that we have around the organization. But the processes are narrowly formed around those applications, and hence very little data reuse is possible. Now, back to the old days, the object orientation was supposed to be about reusing data. Realistically, now we are simply not reusing data, actually reusing code. And realistically, every measurement that we have shows we are not reusing code. If you thought about which would be easier to reuse, a piece of data that's well-defined or a piece of code that's rather poorly described, and the answer, of course, is data. So shift here, and a very subtle one again, as Lewis mentioned before. If you start with your strategy, objectives, perfectly fine, but next let's develop organization-wide information requirements. These are assets that the organization needs to manage. They've put a lot of time and money into getting them to that stage. Let's make sure they actually can. Then we do network and infrastructure, and then and only then should we talk about systems and applications? This is a cleaner approach, a less complicated approach to systems development than the way we've talked about it before. It means that the data assets can be developed from an organization-wide perspective, that the system supports the organizational needs instead of the other way around, and we can maximize our data and information reuse. If we don't do it this way, the only alternative, the traditional systems development lifecycle, is guaranteed to produce more small piles of data, exactly what we don't want to have.
So, and Peter, again, I think these slides, because in this information, this approach, I use it all the time when we're talking to new clients and existing clients, and it's just hugely powerful. But in the context of the data strategy, clearly, data and information being clear to the goals and objectives and the strategy, now it makes more sense. The data strategy now makes more sense, right? Because it is the thing that falls out of the business piece that sits at the top.
So when we look at this from that perspective, we also have to talk about who's involved. And ideally, leadership should be there, some sort of chief that reports with the business lines that talks about how data as an asset should be used to achieve the organizational objectives. In addition to that, and this is a relatively new development. I say that in the sense that we haven't been having data governance conversations around this. We used to call it something different, but governance has actually gotten some very good out there in the field. We also have a bunch of different stakeholders, our CX levels, CEO, CFO, COO, CIO, et cetera, lines of business, senior managers, and team leads. All of these are going to be stakeholders that are going to have a role to play in the development of your strategy. Finally, of course, you need to have the data team, again, architects, modelers, developers, analysts, and stewards. Stewards in particular here, because stewards are the ones that are going to be charged with implementation of the strategy in the very near future. The part of this, though, we've seen recently a need for a new individual called a Chief Data Officer here. The Chief Data Officer is the person who can guarantee that the applications group doesn't start developing things until they have organization-wide definitions of the data. One of the questions we get here at Data Blueprint often enough is, I'm going to make my agile processes go faster. And the only way to make agile speed up is by taking data out of it. That's another whole topic. We could talk about that some other time. But again, what we have is the traditional analysis process is told incorrectly to everybody who's taken it. So we've trained smart people wrong. The data job should be coordinating with the top information technology jobs through a data governance organization. This will allow them now to start getting better at the process. Again, our focus here on the CDO is that they should be dedicated 100% to data asset leveraging. They should be unconstrained by IT project mindset and report directly to the business.
And it's the book in the bottom right hand corner. Peter has a book out there.
Publisher, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's the case for the Chief Data Officer. So, okay. So and we're going through and talking about the different really components that make up a data strategy. Peter just talked about people. So data, determine what is important. This is a really important concept and sometimes not understood. Not all your data is important. Using the business needs and success criteria we've talked about, will help to identify the scope of the data needed as part of your overall data strategy solution. Here, we've listed the meta types of data as we think of them. I'm sure someone else could have a different take, have a lot more, maybe slightly differently, but our collective years of designing, developing global systems and their different circumstances and contexts, these are the ones that make sense to us. It always comes back to looking at the data in these buckets, whether it's architecture, governance, or quality controls. We have data strategy that is really fully focused on the consumption side of these meta types. So a lot of times it's looking at reporting analytical data and metadata, and maybe some of the master data. So we're proposing that the data strategy really needs to consider all the meta types, traditional data, event data as well. Are the sources for reporting analytics? Master data impacts of transactions and events as much as it does reporting analytics. So the point here really is that all types are really interrelated to create a holistic ecosystem, and data strategy needs to support the concept. So, Peter, I thought you invented ROD. Apparently not, but if you could talk about that.
I wish I could figure out where we actually got it from, but ROD stands for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And what that means is that it turns out when we measure it, 80% of data out there is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, which means it just gets in the way of your decision-making process. So one of the things we can help to do with the data strategy is figuring out what data is important, why it's important, and what we have to do to make it more useful around us. Again, if you don't have that handled, then we're trying to take on a problem that's 5x times the size that we normally like to do it. And while that's fine for consultants, you know, we tend not to get paid by the hour, we get paid by the project.
That's right. And so wondering what that picture is on the slide.
It's some rock.
It's some rock. So now we talked about people and we talked about data, data management practices. So we're going to walk you through all the components of the technical and foundational practices you can see there in the wheel on the right-hand side. Helping the data strategy, the important point is to understand which of those components are needed and to what degree they needed to support the data strategy.
Here's little examples along the way.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those. So, I mean, but these are integrated concepts and they need to be thought of like that. Here today, we're just going to walk through each one of them and introduce each one. And we'll be diving into these a lot more at the workshop at EDW, giving more definition and showing how they work in concert together. But just a quick note, you know, there are other data management practices not covered here. Data security, business continuity are two clearly not mentioned. These important components and this view could be expanded to include those, especially if they're important to your business and it's been something that's been on the forefront of newspapers lately. But I just make that comment.
So the key for these foundational practices that we find when we go in and help groups either untangle a mess that they have or plan something, to focus too narrowly on one instead of, in our recommendation, at least 3 pieces. So people get fixated on a data warehouse and they think the data warehouse is going to solve the problem. It turns out the data warehouse in fact solve the problem, but we've seen lots of very well-functioning data warehouse failures because it functions, but they've forgotten the other pillars that go into this. I'll give you an example in just a second here. But think of it always, if you're not incorporating at least 3 of these practices around, you're probably not seeing enough of the picture on this. So on this is a healthcare data warehouse we saw at one point, and it took them about 18 months and $30 million to build this. And we dove into it because we were asked to take a quick evaluation of it. There were almost 2 million members, but almost 1.5 million providers. So it was almost a provider per member. Sounds like a great state to go live in. On the other hand, in this data warehouse, 800,000 of the 1.4 million providers had no primary key, which meant we couldn't access them if we wanted to. And we're still, this entire data warehouse ended up having 1 user. So imagine the volume and forcefulness with which the CEO said to me, I could have taken a room full of MBAs and accomplished this analysis much more quickly.
So just again, keep tying it back to the theme of the data strategy and tying this in with the business. You know, we find that if a solution is taking forever to implement or if it's overly complicated, it's only because you don't understand why you're doing it. You really don't understand the drivers of the solution. So I'm almost always, if I walk into a new environment and someone is struggling, trying to implement some system for 2 years and it's taken them forever to do it, it's because they really don't know why they're doing it and what the requirements are.
And so if they do finish, they'll probably build a great solution that would have been wonderful 2 years ago.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
So look at this foundational practice is, data strategy is one of the foundational practices. Again, we've already talked about aligning with the business strategy and the operational model, and this is going to become even more important as we do this. But gosh, again, another call that we get here at Data Blueprint a lot is people want us to develop a big data strategy for them. I'd say we'd be happy to do that. What's your data strategy? And we don't know and we don't care. And it's like, no, that's the wrong answer. Again, we want to be very careful in terms of working through this. You don't want a big data strategy if you don't have a data strategy in the first place. Another foundational practice then is architecture. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but when you explain what a data architecture does to the organization, if you talk in terms of developing a common vocabulary, so that everybody, when they talk about certain concepts, they know what they mean because they're formalized. What the purpose of a data architecture is to help you get on that same page. Our observation is that most organizations have data assets that are not supportive of their strategy. The question becomes, how can they more effectively use their architectures to support the strategy implementation? Another key piece to all of this, again, 10 years ago, we might have said, well, we have data governance covered in data administration, but it's been a lot more successful since we've broken it out and addressed it explicitly. The key there is to avoid data governance, and I've got a fellow in my class for one of those credit card companies as well who says, oh gosh, you're giving me more reasons to say no to people. Well, that's not what governance should be about. It's about saying no. It may be a sense that sometimes you have to say not yet. But that is really not where you want to be. Governance is the idea that we're going to be treating data as an asset. After all, you have fiscal governance in your organization. You have all kinds of disciplines that you put in place that we need to make sure these are the right ones.
Okay. So again, there are two components to the data management practices, the foundational and the technical practices. So we'll introduce some of the technical practices here. Really all about building stuff, right? How to go about it in a holistic way. We keep talking about thinking like an engineer, using architecture. And if you've done all the other part of the strategy well, this starts to become self-evident. It needs to happen. Again, if you're struggling to figure out what the technical solution should be, I would go back and look. It doesn't mean that there won't be technical challenges. It just means if you're having a challenge figuring out what you need to do, then that should be a flag. So we're going to, as we talk through this, we'll talk about some examples as well. So data quality being one of the technical practices. This is where knowing what data is important is critical to data quality, because we talked about at the very beginning, huge amounts of volumes of data in our organizations. It's just flooding in, and it can't all be correct, standardized all the time. So that's where if you want to put controls and governance in place, you need to do it for your most important data elements, and this is the only way that we've ever seen being really successful with data quality. But at the same time, you'd be really surprised about how much your organization would run if there are a few key data elements with great quality controls and governance around them. And then you could take something like a customer ID. And if a customer can be uniquely identified consistently across a whole organization, that organization could probably just change in so many ways that they hadn't even dreamed of. And so it's not like you have to fix everything maybe about the customer, but if you could just identify the customer or types. So I had worked with a particular company where, the customer type, where they managed it well, or someone who managed customer data, didn't report up through the IO, report directly to somebody at executive level. If you wanted to add a new data type for customer, you had to go through about a 3-month adjudication process, and it was a big deal. But because you do that, they could share customer data, they could roll up customer data, and it really was a beautiful thing. So, but the other key point on this slide is, and I don't know how many people get into this situation, but if you have data quality problems and you figure out what data you want to manage, the root cause. The find and fix is just, while it may seem like you can make progress in the short term, over the long term, it isn't sustainable, and you can never really get ahead of it. So it's worth the effort. While it will look very maybe at the beginning to go fix the root cause, but it is the only way really to deal with the data quality issues you want to fix.
This is a of requirements that is not typically well done. So when we talk about a data strategy, we don't tend to express the explicit integration requirements that are there. We kind of draw some pictures up and say this stuff should all talk to each other, but talking to it is not really the same thing as integration. And data turns out to have it be perfect at the most atomic level, or it won't integrate. Again, half a character or a number off is going to result in a different object being pulled. So the idea to gain insight is to gain integration. And the more and the broader we can focus our integration efforts, the easier it becomes to achieve our data strategies.
So data platforms, so really about decoupling the functionality using these engineering architectural concepts we keep talking about. And we have two examples Peter will talk about, one in cloud, but they're related to migrating from legacy platforms to newly engineered data platforms. One example I want to talk about is unwinding a mainframe in a high volume transactional environment. The business strategy for that was that they wanted to efficiently process those transactions, high transaction volume. So the more people had to touch the transactions, the more people had to do to figure out if they needed to touch the transactions, the less efficient they were. So the business strategy there was for high operational efficiency, and that translated into straight-through processing concepts in terms of the overall design and architecture. So the straight-through processing of transactions means minimize the amount of human intervention that's required to process those transactions. And so that what we're able to do then is you have to then enable those transactional, which is really a set of data. You have to figure out what data components, whether it be exception management or some type of lifecycle management or master data, that would enable that straight-through processing. So these data platforms really, driven from your business strategy, become very, very evident.
So there's one of the examples I remember you told me earlier on too was you're working with a trading system, and the link was not, the constraint was not so much the number of trades they could do, but the number of errors that they kicked off that they couldn't process so well. So by reducing the errors, you were able to increase the volume of that trading system by a very significant amount.
But again, the errors were being created essentially because master data was wrong, and they didn't know really whether it was an error or not. So
another whole talk that we can do.
Yeah.
Just another bit about platforms here. You'll see this a lot where people are trying to get their data into the cloud. And the typical word that they use to describe that process is forklift. Lewis, there are a couple of other words that you use to describe it too, but it's just taking your data and jamming it into the cloud. It's great for the cloud vendor. So we say that if you're going to put your data in the cloud, that have three attributes, data in the cloud, that it doesn't have outside the cloud. One, there should be less of it in volume just based on the ROT that we've talked to you about. I hope you all agree that the data in the cloud should be cleaner than the data outside of the cloud. If it's not, what's the point? And finally, it should be engineered to be more shareable. And those three attributes make a huge difference in terms of that platform.
Okay, thanks. So the second here on the technical practices, business intelligence. So we really think of this as reporting and analytics. This is a spectrum of really that consumption. It's at the end of the food chain, really, of the data. And this is clearly highly dependent on the elements, right? This is all about integration. This is all about platforms, quality, metadata. So and it's obvious when this is not done well, right? Because there are spread marks everywhere, and there are shadow IT solutions built by your operational staff using Microsoft Access. So you can pretty much walk into an environment and determine very quickly how a business intelligence solution has been developed. If people are having to create a basically beginning to end access system every time they need a new report, you know that it's not working. But clearly, this is exploratory in nature. The business intelligence tends to be you want to develop in an agile method. You want to put things in front of the users, have them react, because typically once they get answers to one set of questions, they begin to have a new set of questions right behind that. again, this is something that's highly dependent on governance, quality, metadata in order for it to work really well.
Component to all this is that you've got to have an idea of how your data strategy is going to interact specifically with your business. And the goal here is that we want to tie it to specific business processes. A tool that some of you are familiar with is a CRUD matrix, but let's talk about how the CRUD matrix actually works. The CRUD matrix talks about whether the data that's in the center of the matrix is created, read, updated, or deleted by various business processes that are going, in this case, across the top of the matrix. So when we do this, we understand scope, we understand use data, we understand lifecycle pieces. All of these things are important to this, and your strategy can get down and say, we're going to start acting these processes in one form or another. Let me give you an example on this as well, which is that when you're trying to decide what technology selection to get, again, a platform piece, typically what happens to most of the data issues in there is that when you discover the software that match your organizational practices, you then have more choices. You can change the software, you can change your business practice, you can do some combination of the both, or you can ignore the problem. But where do you get guidance to do this? A data strategy would have revealed the problem in advance of selecting that particular approach. So the example I'm showing here is one that we've used a lot. A person can be an employee. A person can be multiple employees. In this case, we're explicitly building a system that permits moonlighting, but also in that it's going to give you simpler reporting. Again, we can do a lot more on that. We won't. The key is that as you understand these business practices around this, you can take these components of data management, and I've got them listed here: program coordination, integration, stewardship, development, and operations, and start to match them up. Because if you don't match them, you end up with some numbers like this. And these are just from one particular group here, where we have lots and lots of things that are happening. If they're happening a lot and not optimized, then your organization is going to suffer death by 1,000 cuts. So when we summarize this particular piece, what we're really trying to do is to get people to think differently about the solution, not how we've taught them. It's a holistic process focusing on people management, technology, and processes that addresses the gaps to give sustainable solutions, and most importantly, it's matched to your organization's ability to deliver. Crawling, walking, and running, which is our final section we're getting into.
Yeah, thank you. So develop a roadmap and plan, and again, we're really introducing the topic here with the expectation we're going to get into it in depth at EW. So really, when we're talking about the implementation plan roadmap, we're not saying that a project plan with the early start date and the late finish date. We're really talking about the approach to implementation. What's the long-term vision for how this will be executed? What are the key milestones? The important part here is it needs to be achievable, realistic in the organization's capabilities. Run into this time and time again, go into organizations where they're just trying to do too much given their level capabilities. So Peter, his crawl, walk, run concept and how that's applied, I think, is absolutely perfect. And we have found people have gotten burned by trying to do too much. They come back to this, and it makes complete sense.
So you're looking at what in terms of crawling, and this is the message that you want to have in your strategy too, is that we haven't done this in the past, we need to start, but we're not going to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 2 seconds. So crawling is identifying the opportunities and determining a just large-scale scope allows learning to occur. Again, remember back to the 4-quadrant model. Move from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2 and focus in on developing the ability to take data management and derive specific, tangible amounts of money that people in the corner offices will pay attention to. Walking then may be better at that particular process, optimizing it, and then running is the fun part where we get into all the analytics and stuff like that. And by the way, if you've saved enough money in quadrant 2, quadrant 3 pays for itself.
The benefits, and I think Peter's much touched on these, allows, and the last point being the foundational components to be developed developed while currently executing tactical solutions. So with that, I think the end of the content.
At the top of the hour, now it's time for your questions here. And again, this will be played out in excruciatingly more detail at our session. We hope to see everybody in Austin because it's a wonderful, fun town to have a lot of fun and interact with hopefully about 800 other data managers. Seems like 800,000 some days. We get in there on Sunday afternoon and we don't leave until Thursday, and it's a full week. So, Megan, turn it over to you for the questions. Sure on that one, Louis.
Thank you, Peter and Louis. That was an awesome presentation. Now it's time for everyone's questions. It's time for the Q&A. So just click on the Q&A window feature at the top of your screen. You should be able to submit your questions through that Q&A window. And we've actually had a few questions already come in, so we can go ahead and jump right into it. The first question is, what are your comments on an IT shop which is completely cutting data specialists out of the picture because the only thing valued is speed of application delivery? What consequences of this approach? Can it succeed?
We agree that this is a shooting yourself in the foot sort of strategy. One of the things we talk about is putting the I back in IT. And when you throw all your data specialists out, you're really focusing in on T. And T can do things really, really well, but it can mess things up really, really fast as well. So we definitely advocate an approach that says make sure you've got qualified individuals in your organization to do this.
Am I allowed to move to go back to the slides since this is my first time?
I think you know what number it is, so you can.
But no, I don't. But I think it's a great question, and see it all the time. And it gets back to these slides here. So this really what went on is that I think the question is around this this in here where well, I can't get to the right one. It's where it's at the bottom. There you go. I think it's a challenge because to me that just screams that the organization is struggling to see the role where data plays in the organization. And so they're looking at it as being something that comes after systems application development. There's not an easy answer to that. I think I would take these two slides and see if you could even have some conversations around that. But it is about getting data to be the thing that you focus on, because as Peter says, as soon as you buy SAP as your application, then all the other conversations from there on are about what SAP does and doesn't do and how it does it. And there's no conversation saying, what information does my organization need, regardless of what system that we end up purchasing. So
whoever asked that question, if you'll identify yourself, I'll send you a pre-production copy of the CDO book. There's a lot of good arguments in there. See if that doesn't help turn things around.
Next question is, do you recommend that data governance ownership sit in the IT organization?
That's a great question. Our ideal approach is that data governance is a shared function between business and IT, but to correct for past errors, we advocate that the leadership of that organization report into the business. It's not so much that the IT people don't know what they're doing, but it's that if we can help to educate the business and make them understand that they have a stake in this and that the organization just can't do without them, then definitely we want to try error in this case to correct for some of the past errors where we've had. The question from the person before was very indicative of this. They clearly didn't see the value that these individuals were producing, and they're de-emphasizing it, whereas they can measure the lines of code that are produced by their agile teams, and they like that.
So one thing that, and this isn't directly related to the question, but kind of, and that I wanted to mention in the presentation, because a lot of times, you know, to deal with data governance, we apply the crawl, run concept, and it's, we call it little g. So what we end up doing is because people, we find that people will go away and a lot of work, create an 80-page document about how the governance should work and who's going to play what role, and it just becomes just a very large task without really having any practice at governance at all. So we think it's important and crawl as an example would be to pick a single data element that the business and IT and the data team can work on together. maybe customer ID, or maybe it's some other key data element, and what are the governance rules and what are the business rules around that, and start with some little g and build into the larger G over time.
Yeah, so we can extend that a little further. We had a hospital group that we worked with recently that decided admission date was the place that they wanted to start, and they found about 7 different definitions of admission date, which was kind of low for an organization. But they also found that by using multiple definitions of admission date, the hospital was leaving literally millions of dollars on the floor because they weren't able to correctly bill for the services that they were putting out.
Yeah,
huge example.
You know, again, I think going back to, people just have a hard time when they look at their whole inventory of data assets of trying to figure out how to tackle the whole thing. Really, you know, once you start to look at it, you'll find that 5% or less of your data make a huge difference in, in your organization.
It's all about leverage.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody asked the question, for those of us unable to attend the conference, how can we get the presentation slides for the conference? And pretty much if you want to come back to or go to the Data Blueprint website, check that. We'll have the slides posted closer to the actual conference, so end of April. So just keep an eye on that. And so another question for you guys is, what is the best way to develop business relevant analytics that can be put to good use?
So strategy is what guides it. That should be one of the goals of strategy, is to say not just we're doing data for data's sake, as Lewis says, but in fact to say this data strategy is designed to achieve these business values, this value, and those objectives are tangible and meaningful to people in the C-suites.
So, and I would suggest that even, the concept of data, we're supposed to be exploratory, and I'm supposed to be, we were supposed to be discovering new things that we didn't know before. It still has some directional component to it, or direction from a business strategy perspective. So, because you can't just, to do big data for big data's sake, it's a lot where people built a data warehouse, and you go in and they don't know why they built the data warehouse. They knew that they wanted it for reporting, and that they wanted to be able to have better reporting, basically. And it ended up that when they built it, they didn't know why they built it, and therefore it wasn't adding value. So I think, again, I just can't overemphasize the crawl, walk, run approach to business analytics, and especially business analytics, because that is very much an exploratory, put something together, get some feedback. And so that means a lot of foundational work needs to be done, so that you can get into that sort of rhythm with your business users of presenting them stuff, seeing what questions that answers, and find out what new questions they have. But they're going to want to be able to trust the data. They're going to want to be able to, see an integrated view. So doing some of those foundational things will position you better, I think, to get to business analytics and to be able to work with your users more easily.
And if guided by a strategy, another important component can be say, look, the reason what we're doing today is different from what we were doing in the past is because in the past we used to follow an old SDLC, and that produced a certain level of results. But if we instead, for example, put into our strategy that we are going to fail 3 times in the time that most people would take to build it once, we will get better at that particular process because we have the opportunity to iterate, where other organizations try for a big bang approach and, again, miss it entirely, which then people say, well, what the heck was the point?
So, and if I can just continue to make this a long answer, and we're beating the horse here of data strategy, but, I think the important thing to realize, and especially with business analytics, is there is something important to the business, and it's important if you measure it. If the business is measuring it, it's important. So that's the thing that you're looking for. That's the thing you want to go after when you're looking at business analytics. What does the business measure? How do they measure their success? And they may even be doing it in a spreadsheet, but that's the thing you want to go after.
I would refine that a touch, though, because the things they're measuring are things that are important to them. What we need to find out is what they value after those measurements, though. And so, again, get up beyond that first layer of management where you're collecting these aggregate statistics. The example I use many times is that if we paid shirt salespeople by number of orders that they had, every order would contain one shirt, because people are very efficient at maximizing their particular measures. That may not be the measure that you want to use, although the things that are measurable should be the candidates from which we take the high-level constructs and put them together.
Okay, we have some more questions rolling in. The next one is, you spoke about a common language in semantics. Is canonical a dirty word in the current IT environment?
We're both chuckling on that one. So I think the answer to that's generally yes, and it shouldn't be. Canonical sounds like it's sort of biblical, and people don't want to get into that because it implies that there's sort of a war about arguing about definitions, and that's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is practicality, saying if we're not speaking the same language, we will run into some problems in there.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot that I agree, Peter, with what you're saying there.
Again, what we tend to see in this industry is that people will get fixated on an idea. 5 years ago, we might have said that master data management was falling into that same category. Oh, everybody's got to have master data management. I can remember explaining the concept to a wizened friend of mine who says, oh, you're just implementing the concept that some data is more important than others? Yeah, absolutely, we should do that. And we have a master and transaction file that would go all the way back in the 1950s to use on this sort of thing. So by the way, master data management didn't ruin anybody, but I've seen a lot of failed master data management implementations. We would never try to take you down an analytics path unless you had some concept, particularly the straight-through processing that Lewis was talking about. It's impossible to do without master data management. Absolutely.
Okay, for that, if you can't make the conference, there's actually a video only that you can do if the attending isn't an option. So there's that. Yeah, that's pretty, Our question is, let's see here, who is accountable for metadata management?
So great question, and the short answer is everybody, but of course that doesn't help. That's why we got into this situation in the first place. I like to say that the language of data governance is metadata. If you're not expressing your data governance goals and objectives, going all the way back into your strategy, in metadata management in terms that are specifically identified as pieces of metadata, then you risk that disconnection. The gaps occur, things start to drift. Again, I can't say it any simpler than that. The language of data governance is metadata.
I think, Peter, my perspective, and for everyone, in the things I've built, metadata really matters when you're doing business intelligence and reporting of some sort. At that point, you're so much touching the business that the business has such a big role to play, but they really in all your data. But that really is, in many ways, part of that common language is and semantics and figuring out what the data really means to the business is in that layer. And it's when the data is being consumed. Now, I understand there are other types of metadata that can help drive processing and that can help you manage the overall environment from a technical perspective. But really where the business value is when the people are able to consume the data is at that point is where the definition needs to be managed. And there's no way around that the business has to be so involved in that, or, there's just no way that a data person or IT person can really define the metadata for someone else.
Let me add one more piece on that, Lewis. This is one I keep meaning to make a slide I haven't gotten to, but it turns out the business actually understands metadata a lot more than the executives in the organizations do. And I'm not saying bad things about the executives, but you'll find that when we go out and find shadow IT shops in the business, the guy with the SQL server under his desk who says, "You caught me, but please don't tell IT that I've got this system running here." That individual absolutely understands metadata. They may not know the name for it, but when you start to talk to them about it, they instantly grasp the concept. Right. So very definitely the business is largely responsible for pushing some of these topics and also for providing the actual words, the vocabulary that we're going to use in there. Helpful.
Okay, next question is, how long would it take to go through the foundational stuff for a major departmental group of a company, say manufacturing org?
Develop a strategy. So the engagement process should be something along the lines that Lewis has described before, which is to say, first of all, what is the business strategy in there? Hopefully there's an IT strategy driving that. And then we want to look at what the format of their data assets is. What are the characteristics of the assets that they have? Taking that particular process, learning from the strengths and weaknesses of their existing data pool, and everybody has some strengths and some weaknesses, we can then come back to that IT strategy in conjunction with the business strategy and say, how do we leverage data in there best for that organization? The process can be done in literally a number of weeks. I don't mean full-time weeks, but it does take some time to assess and to assimilate this. Somebody's learning a new business.
Just to get some metrics around that, Peter, because this is our bread and butter in many ways. So in a large organization that has the world operates in silos, so it'll have multiple business units, and even if those are products or administrative silos. But in a business unit in a large organization, we'll spend anywhere from 8 to 16 weeks developing the overall strategy. So if you're just looking at foundational pieces, it could be potentially a subset of that, but still that upfront work of understanding the business needs and the measures, it still has to be fully done. It's just the solution that you actually develop could be smaller. And I think actually, it's a really good question, because a lot of times we get asked to do strategies.
How much to do for me by Friday?
No, it's not that. It's, but it's very focused around, a particular area. And it will be clear to them why they need architecture, or it'll be very clear to them why it's mostly around quality. Now, all those things will have multiple components, foundation technical components involved, but it becomes clear that there is kind of a focus in on what they're looking for, what is needed, but we still, we just will beat up our customers and to the point we understand what it is they're trying to solve from a business perspective, or we'll say to them, we don't know how to do that.
We have a question. It's what are carrots to get an organization to begin to put business rules, data standards, data models, and writing with transparency?
Saying that data is an organization's sole, non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset. And unpack that particular phrase, you'll understand that data is the only asset that organizations have that doesn't degrade over time. You can't use it up. And it is a durable asset, which means it needs to be treated differently from a financial perspective than a non-durable asset, or in this case, an office consumable type of process. If that argument doesn't get to them, then I go back to the CDO book, where I ask a couple of really insightful questions, like, who's doing this? If nobody's doing this organization, how is this function occurring? How are these types of things going? It's kind of a difficult process, but there are a couple of key questions that you can ask that will really start to identify that.
So I think, say it, and I guess we assume this, right? But the data strategy is a top-down approach to improving or making data more leverageable within an organization, right? And sometimes organizations just aren't ready for that. And if you're looking to take carrots, to me that almost is more of a bottoms-up approach. And we certainly understand that, and that is a valid approach as well. And so some of the things that we look at are when you talk about standards or quality, and what's the carrot is that typically the low-hanging fruit is operational efficiency. So we call it non-value-added work. So it can look for those areas where, in our example of the PhD researchers at the chemical company, literally, I'm not kidding, 70% of their time was spent manipulating the data just so that they could go be big data scientists. 7% of guys who, God knows how much they make, is spent manipulating. I mean, when I say manipulate, well, you saw the diagram. So it's where the typical low-hanging fruit is you can start to give them a carrot and say, I can eliminate so many hours a day, or across the team of 20 people and that adds up to this much money. Those are typically the easier things to find. But that isn't, that's a bottoms-up approach as opposed to the top-down strategy approach.
Both can work, but top-down is more favorable.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. No more questions, but some great questions came in from guys. It was a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks again to Dataversity and Shannon for hosting us. Once again, you will receive today's materials within the next 2 business days. Our webinar next month will be Emerging Trends in Data Jobs. Hopefully, you'll be able to join us for that as well. And as always, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Everyone, and have a great day.
Peter, thanks, Lois, and thanks, Megan, for another fantastic presentation. Just love it and thank everyone for attending and for all the great interaction and questions. And again, as Megan said, I hope everyone has a great day.